Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Joshua Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement, and a former health commissioner here in Baltimore. Our goal is to bring evidence and experience to illuminate critical public health issues. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith Rogers, producer of Public Health on Call, and we want to hear from you. In more than 500 episodes since March 2020, we've been bringing you the latest on urgent public health topics like COVID-19, climate change, gun violence, monkeypox, racism, and more. We'll continue to cover these, but we'd like to know, what other public health topics would you like to hear more about? Plus, you can enter to win some amazing podcast swag, including the beach tote featured on our Twitter account. Please go to publichealth.jhu.edu/publichealthoncall/survey to take a brief survey of potential future topics. This will be open until September 9th, and that link is publichealth.jhu.edu/publichealthoncall/survey. We're excited to hear from you, and thank you so much for listening.
Today, my guest is Dr. Robert Califf, the Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. The FDA is now reviewing data on combination booster shots for the fall. I speak to Dr. Califf about the work going into these reviews, the steps that FDA takes to explain its decisions, and how sharing factual information is now everyone's responsibility. Let's listen. Dr. Rob Califf, thank you so much for joining me here on Public Health on Call. You have a very busy job, and we realize how great it is to hear directly from the FDA Commissioner. How are you doing today?
Thanks for having me on. It's good to be here. I'm doing fine, having a good day.
Good. You have a tough job.
Well, it has its challenges, but it's fun to have challenges. It's like a big puzzle with many potential solutions, and I get to work with a great crew of people. As Josh, as you know quite well, you've worked so closely both within FDA and across all the different public health agencies.
Well, I like your metaphor of a puzzle, because when the pieces fit together, the FDA can do some incredible things. Now, you have looked at that puzzle from many dimensions in your career, from many perspectives, both as someone who has helped develop many drugs that were approved, and then twice now as FDA Commissioner. What's new these days as you think about the challenges facing the agency?
Well, as you know, for background, as you well know, I was Deputy Commissioner and then Commissioner in 2015, 2016. Those were fascinating times, but they were nothing like the intensity that I've experienced this time around. I would say the intensity is tenfold higher. The country is divided along many fronts. That plays out in the politics that affect the FDA, as you well know, but also the vast changes in technology and the way people get information has had a huge impact on the way that FDA functions. So this has been a busy, really challenging time just in the few months that I've been back.
I remember at FDA, the basic approach to getting information out when I was there was something called a conference call. And we would do a conference call, and hundreds of journalists would dial in, and we would answer questions for like a half hour, and then we'd go like, okay, now we've gotten the information out there. I don't think at the time I was even allowed to have a Twitter account. And things have really changed since then.
I was blocked from having a Twitter account when I was commissioner. And I noticed that Andy Slavitt, who was running CMS, had a Twitter account. And I forgot to ask him about it till after we were out of our jobs. And I called him one day and said, how did you get to do all those tweets? And he said, they told me I couldn't do it, but I just did it anyway. And so maybe I should have been a little stronger in my views. And of course, Twitter, like almost all technology these days, is a double-edged sword. And I sort of think of it as the good old days when I was a busy intensive care practitioner, which I did for 3.5 decades. It was pretty straightforward, it seemed. Companies developed products, they got them judged by the FDA. There was agreement reached on the labels. The labels dictated the information that could be transmitted by the companies, uniquely in the U.S., including advertisements. We could have That's not the topic today, but it might be a fun topic for another day. But most of it was in a hierarchical professional context where the prescriber or the implanter in the case of devices was assumed to be a learned intermediary who would then transfer the information to patients and families. Of course, we now know that left out a lot of people who were just not part of the system. Now everyone can be reached, but that whole process happens again. So at the minute the FDA makes a pronouncement, there's 24/7 streaming of misinformation, disinformation, agreement and disagreement, all happening in real time in an ocean of information where most people don't have a compass to figure out which direction to go.
Well, I think that is a really important point that it's even before a decision comes out, there's all kinds of misinformation that is out there, and people may be getting it 100, 1,000 times before the FDA steps forward with its view and its decision and trying to explain that. It may already be deep into a hole. How does that change what the FDA does? I know the days of just a single conference call may be behind us, but what's new at the FDA to try to account for the different information environment?
Well, let me make an appeal to the audience here because if I was telling you that we had it figured out, I'd be lying, and I don't do well with not telling the truth. So we got a lot to figure out yet about this new environment that we're in. But for sure, we have to spend a lot more time thinking about what has been called a pre-bottle, that is anticipating what the misinformation output will be and trying to answer those questions that might come up ahead of time. Then also reaching a much broader distribution of channels. That is, I learned a lot about this, Josh, and I think you may have also from the tobacco side of things, where the FDA has a budget for advertising, using the same advertisers who advertise for the tobacco industry. And you learn right away that many people now are segmented into channels of information that don't cross over. So you might send out a great message, but if it's going to one channel, it may not reach a large number of people in another. And then you just got to be on your toes, as you well know. Once the message comes out, you have to listen and respond as quickly as you can.
So, Dr. Califf, in place of the huge conference call limited to media, what does FDA do these days?
Well, we go well beyond just talking to the media. We live stream events, and we, it's well known that attention span these days in the era of videos is, on the order of 1 to 3 minutes. A very successful thing we've done are the 1-minute shows that Peter Marks does about vaccination that a lot of people tune into and sort of fits in the course of a busy day. So we're looking for ways to reach a much broader audience by making things available and opening ourselves up.
So people can go to the FDA website and see a whole bunch of content and watch some of those initial announcements live.
That's right. You got it.
Well, you're headed into a new fall of COVID with the alignment and the people to spread the message that we have. Maybe not the full system that you want, but what we have a big challenge coming in the fall, potentially with influenza coming back and unknown variants headed our way. In all of that, the FDA is now considering some new boosters for COVID at the time, at least that we're recording this. And I wonder, given that we already know there's information and misinformation circulating about this, what the pre-buttal, what the explanation of this process and decision is right now. What do you want people to know?
The primary message is that being vaccinated and getting the appropriate boosters reduces your risk of dying or getting critically ill and going to the hospital, does reduce the risk of transmission to some extent, variable depending on the variant. And also now it's looking like it will also reduce the risk of long COVID, although that's less solid information right now. And so that's the primary information, is that people need to know that if they're up to date, caught up on their vaccinations, it's the greatest thing you can do to be around, come the holiday season coming up at the end of the year.
Now, what can you say about the new products that are under consideration at the moment that we're talking? Products that have both the original strain of the virus to generate a vaccine, as well as the parts of the BA4, BA5 virus. What's the logic behind that approach?
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I just find still the story of the original vaccine, the ancestral vaccine, so to speak, it's almost miraculous how effective it was. But of course, the virus has continued to mutate and has versions that are escaping the immunity that we have from either being infected with a prior version or a prior vaccine. And we've also learned that with this type of vaccine in this situation, the effect wanes over time, over the course of months. And so through a series of meetings with experts and interactions with the industry that makes vaccines, Peter Marks, who heads up our vaccine effort, concluded that we needed to spur the industry on, which they were doing anyway, to develop vaccines specific for the variants that are now in circulation. And so we now have applications in that we're considering that are up to date for the latest variant that's now circulating the BA5 vaccine. And it's a bivalent vaccine. So half of it is still towards the original virus, which we know is effective. And then the other half is towards these new circulating variants. And of course, we know there's an immune response generated in preclinical models, but we're early on, and to stay ahead of the curve, we've got to develop these things quickly.
And you used a word I want to call attention to. You said FDA is considering. There's a lot in that word, considering a new product. Some people on social media might have you believe that, you as the commissioner wake up one morning, you read your newspaper, you have a glass of orange juice, then you make a quick decision on a vaccine that, based on, how you're feeling that morning. What does it really mean for FDA to consider a product?
Well, of course, you've spent so much of your career working on issues related to this. It is an intensive process involving many people with different levels of expertise in different areas who function as a team. There's the preclinical data, there's the clinical human studies data, there's the manufacturing, there's the quality as it actually gets into actual production. All those things have to be considered, not to mention the words that are used to describe the findings. So this is an enormous effort in every case. And I do take great pride that the US FDA, I think, is the gold standard of regulatory agencies. Very importantly, the FDA does its own analysis of the data, which other regulatory agencies don't do. They take the analysis from the companies. And this independent analysis in and of itself is a major effort because often these are very complicated data that require a deep understanding of the field in order to do the right analyses.
I was always impressed working at the agency. You turn the corner in the hall and run into one of the top experts in a very specific part of the review of applications for medical products. It could be how the study is designed or how the product has to get made. And they're all coming together, like you said, to do a pretty intensive review. All that gets packed into the word consider. Now, these new products, the bivalent vaccine, has a different kind of study than the study that was used for the original approval. The original approval were tens of thousands of patients, and the studies waited to see whether people got seriously ill with COVID before figuring out whether they worked. Since then, in moving between different age groups, as well as now with this bivalent vaccine, the studies have been based on the immune response. Could you talk a little bit about that and the level of confidence FDA has that will really predict protection from serious illness?
Sure. There's a term we use called totality of evidence, which sort of what we just discussed, all these many people with expertise in different areas come together, look at all the evidence, including the historical evidence, and in this case, we now have multiple versions of the mRNA vaccine, as it's called, with two different companies doing multiple studies, showing that it's been reliable that if you induce an immune response, that is antibodies to the particular virus that you're trying to take care of, that translates into a clinical benefit. And of course, that's always an extrapolation when you make it, but it's what we do with the flu vaccine every year. So it's not something new for us. And sort of the combination of multiple versions of this vaccine over time and the consistency of the immune response that's being elicited by this vaccine is giving us confidence. Now, of course, we're still reviewing the data that the companies have submitted, so we're not ready yet to make that decision. But if it goes as expected according to pattern, we will make that extrapolation.
Got it. I think that's a very important explanation for people to have, that these decisions are based on an enormous amount of information, and where it might not be practical to do another 40,000 person study, that doesn't slow down the FDA from using the data that it has to make the best decisions.
Yeah, one way I've thought about this, and I grew up in clinically and in my research career in a glorious time in cardiology where we did big studies, we proved the benefits and risk over the course of years, and then things came on the market and we could, implement their use in a very deliberate way, armed with really high quality data. In the midst of a pandemic, if you wait for all that data to come in, you've missed the boat. And so you have to be preemptive in a pandemic, which means that you have to take some of the steps that we've taken. But, I have great comfort in the community of experts that have looked at this and are coming to the conclusions that we're in a time now where we can adapt the vaccine to the circumstance and take advantage of prior knowledge. And then, of course, there's post-marketing surveillance and evaluation, which will continue.
That's another important dimension, because the FDA is always looking to see whether or not its decisions need to be modified.
That's right. And, in this case, it has been remarkable. We're preparing some documents that'll be used to talk about this. But if we look at vaccination for COVID, the initial vaccine reduced the risk of death and hospitalization by 90%. And the two booster campaigns, for those who chose to get them, saw a very similar additional reduction in the risk of death and hospitalization. And many people didn't think that would happen. And the booster campaigns happened before we had that clinical data. But I take, as I say, great comfort that it really worked out, that even the second booster worked. And, it used to bother me a lot as a cardiologist when people came in with a heart attack and died when they could have been prevented with appropriate treatment. In this case, we have a free intervention with, very few side effects. Some people are unlucky and there is toxicity that occurs that we have to pay attention to occasionally, but the benefits so far outweigh the risks. It's painful to see that 90+% of people who are dying from COVID today in the United States are not up to date on their vaccinations.
Now, the reason that they are not up to date is not the absence of evidence that would justify them getting vaccinated. It's perhaps that they are trusting news sources other than the FDA, other than people who really understand the data. Trust is such an important issue. You're probably not going to be able to flood, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, every possible channel with more information than there is misinformation, at least not this fall. And so how does the FDA think about trust, both trust for what you say, as well as the partnerships that you need to build trust so that more people can hear your words and pay attention to them?
Well, here I think at the initial part, the FDA has a special role to play in terms of laying out the evidence that the benefits outweigh the risks of the intervention. But I'd stress that overall, as you all know, this is an all-of-government effort to start with. So the CDC, other parts of Health and Human Services are very important. I believe, based on what we've seen so far in the pandemic, that we've in many ways exceeded expectations for part of the population. That is, many people who were in conditions of previous inequities. Tremendous efforts were made to involve communities and neighborhood leaders and religious leaders and others in the effort. And we need to redouble our efforts there because it's tailed off a bit recently. But we also have a very large part of the population. I'm from the rural South, and very large part of the population that is showing very low booster rates and even low vaccination rates in a culture which has become very suspicious about promotion of vaccination, and particularly during the pandemic, but vaccination in general. So we're going to need to recruit people that are part of these various communities to carry the truthful message, which is going to be a big challenge.
Well, I appreciate what you said about laying out the data, making sure people really understand the basis of the FDA's decision. That kind of transparency really helps for all the different people who are looking at this, and particularly all the partners in the clinical community and elsewhere. But also your commitment to doing interviews like this and talking directly to people in many different formats in order to help them understand the incredible work that's going on to try to stay at least a half a step ahead of the virus wherever we can.
Well, thanks so much. And again, I would stress to listeners who may be listening in, to overcome misinformation. I think almost all experts agree the most effective method is another human being who talks to the person who may have gotten misinformation and spends the time to listen to their concerns and offer truthful, reliable information. So I hope we have a bunch of ambassadors out there who will, if you ask the question, what's the simplest intervention that could reduce people's risk of death in the United States over the next few months? I think it's making sure that people are appropriately vaccinated, both this booster campaign and the flu vaccine coming up. And we have the means to do it. It's free to very inexpensive and highly effective.
Well, I can tell you that our listeners are the best and they'll deliver for you, Dr. Califf. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks. It's been great.
Public Health on Call is produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinell, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Holes Fernandez and Amber Bryan Singletary. Thank you for listening.